What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on For the King 2, a turn-based roguelite game inspired by a variety of tabletop adventures. Though right here at the beginning of the video, I do need to inform you that this is in fact sponsored by the game's publisher, Curve Games, and it is being developed by Iron Oak Games. With that in mind, if you like what you see in this video, there's a link in the description below where you can learn more and check out the game's Steam release, which also comes with a 10% launch discount. And from there, let's dive into this thing. As I mentioned, this is a turn-based roguelite game inspired by tabletop adventures. Ultimately, this means we can take up to 4 party members across 5 different adventures that are linked together as a narrative. But those individual adventures consist of moving our party through a series of story objectives that of course relate to the plot, which we're about to talk about, but also include a bunch of procedurally generated events, activities, quests, things like that in the overworld map. With that in mind, though, the game does have a pretty structured story, so let's talk about that a little bit. As this is the second game in the title, it does, of course, follow the events of the first game, with the previously beloved Queen Rosamond having fallen to chaos and corruption a few decades after the first game, where initially her kingdom, after the defeat of chaos previously, enjoyed a relative peace and tranquility. The queen suddenly turned into a tyrant, started imprisoning people if they couldn't pay her exorbitant taxes, which she was using to fund some grand scheme. Naturally, a resistance has popped up to this, which is where the story kicks off, as we form a band of adventurers that make up this resistance, or at least a part of it. And do keep in mind, while you can go through this completely single player, it is available in up to 4-person co-op, so you don't have to go it alone. With that said, the story consists of 5 chapters, which are separate adventures, essentially, that are linked through their narrative, so you don't necessarily have to play through the entire thing all at once, and it can be done bit by bit. From there, though, let's talk about creating a party once we've jumped into the game. The first thing you'll do when picking an adventure is checking out the difficulty. This comes with a variety of presets that affect things like the amount of revives available to you, your loadout points, which we'll talk about momentarily, the speed at which chaos increases on the map, which then gives you more challenging encounters and curveballs, so to speak, on top of the simple prices of everything, and your starting items. And while you can pick the presets, you can also adjust these things individually and go with a more custom setting if you should so choose. But then after that, you can make your actual party, which consists of picking 4 characters and their starting class. While you only have about 5 classes to start with, there will be a total of up to 12 as you unlock them through the roguelite mode, with each class coming with its own strengths and weaknesses. The blacksmith making a great tank, for instance, the hunter having some ranged options, the scholar giving you magic and potentially area of effect abilities. And while each of these classes is of course good at different things, they also gain certain passive abilities on the overworld. For instance, the herbalist on their turn might find herbs just by walking around, giving you extra items to use. The scholar might find scrolls, which give them access to various magical abilities like teleporting on the overworld, for instance, and a variety of other helpful features. You can customize these characters a bit, both cosmetically, their name, but once you've got that sorted out, you go to the loadout screen. When you start an adventure, you get to pick your loadout, as you might imagine, which gives you a set amount of points to spend on gearing that character with a variety of items to start your adventure. Your points to spend is on a per character basis, and the options available for them to start with are based on your previous runs and the things you have unlocked. And we'll talk more about this in just a moment, because after we get this done, we are dropped into the overworld, where we are given our first objective, which varies of course depending on which adventure you're in, but the first one sends you off to a nearby town. But even on the overworld, we are taking turns here, with each character getting a turn in each round. Once all of your characters have taken their turn, the timer up in the top of the screen counts down by 1, which is important for certain timed quests, contracts on mercenaries, and other things. And on every character's turn, they first roll their ability to move, which will determine how many hexes they're allowed to go. They all have a minimum, and then they can potentially earn extra movements based on some rolls behind the scenes, which you can see when that character starts their turn. This can be affected by things like weather, which can be both beneficial or detrimental. And once they have their movement, you can decide where they go and start uncovering various pieces of the map. Now, the hexes with the question marks mean you don't actually know what is there, despite them not being covered by the fog of war. As we get closer to things, though, we'll reveal what is on them, which can be things like enemy encounters, events, towns, or even dungeons. So while the story-specific objectives are pretty much always in the same place, individual things like quests or encounters, things like that, will change from adventure to adventure, making sure that no single playthrough is ever quite the same. Now, the way to complete each adventure is to simply follow the story objectives, but there is more to do. When you go to a town, for instance, you can make use of the services there, which includes simply buying things, healing your party members through a variety of services, or taking on a bunch of side quests, or potentially even hiring a mercenary, as each of our characters can have a follower with them, which can be acquired through random events or just hiring them here in town, though the hired ones do only last for a set amount of turns based on the contract that you paid for. And while you can get up to a variety of side content, you do have to be mindful of the time that is passing, as certain events do need to be completed on certain days, but moreover, as time passes, the background chaos level increases. And as the chaos of the realm increases, we can encounter more and more dangerous activities, enemies, events, etc. Now, an important thing to keep in mind though is while we complete the story objectives, we will be gathering an item called lore. Your lore is important for the roguelite aspect of the game. But before we dive into that, I first want to talk about combat, because as we're exploring, we are almost certainly going to be running into a variety of enemies, both in the overworld and in the game's dungeons. The difference being that overworld encounters are essentially just one battle, whereas the dungeons of the game are a series of multiple rooms that all have to be done at once and can't be fled from. In these dungeons, we'll need to fight enemies as well as deal with certain other types of rooms that can be things like traps or merely rewards and treasure. And these are a pretty great way to gear up your party, as the rewards from the dungeons often coincide with the risk involved, meaning that these are a great way to equip your party with better and better equipment to take on the bigger and more challenging encounters. In between each room, you can usually heal a small amount, and should your companions fall or die, you will be able to revive them in combat based on the amount of revives available to you depending on the difficulty you selected. So the life pool as part of that is the number of times you can revive your companions. Now, as for the combat itself, this is a turn-based tactical affair, which, as I'm sure you've seen on screen here, consists of each side having a small grid of movement available to them on top of a turn order. On each character's turn, they generally get one primary and secondary action, with primary actions being represented by the diamond-shaped icon, and using these generally also ends your turn. However, you can use secondary actions, indicated by the square icon, which can include things like changing out your weapons, or using an item from that character's inventory, as the inventory is typically individual. Now, your skills are generally based on the equipment that that character has, but when they make attacks with those skills, it scales off of the appropriate stat at the same time. So if you're using things like wands or staves with magical attacks, that generally scales off your intelligence. So naturally, you want to equip characters with what they are good at using. But you also have to keep in mind the positioning, as the grid is not just for show. On each character's turn, you can choose to move them, and you might want to do that, as the back row, for instance, gets a bonus to things like evasion, while a character behind another character who has a shield will protect them from being targeted, as they first have to attack the character in front of them. Other times, squares might be affected by things like elemental attacks or environmental effects even, such as rain, fire, etc. So where each character is positioned is also important, as well as each character's armor value. This is made up of typically physical and magic, which blocks the appropriate damage type. So for instance, if I'm attacking a heavily armored guard with melee attacks and I don't deal enough damage to overcome their armor, then I'm not going to be dealing much damage at all. Whereas that same heavily armored guard might not have any magic defense and thus is pretty easy to hit with something like a scholar. And that's before you even start talking things like immunities and abilities that take away enemies' turns, things like that. And when you put all of those pieces together, I think you have a pretty satisfying turn-based tactical experience that weighs pretty heavily both on your character's stats, because as we participate in combat, complete quests, we will be gaining experience and leveling up, which will increase that character's stats. And those stats, combined with that character's equipment, and thus their attack types and abilities, all plays a role in determining your combat effectiveness. Though do keep in mind, if you you are trying to attempt something you're not quite ready for yet, as parts of the map will have general level ranges. The game will tell you you're probably going to be in over your head a little bit. Though, as I've mentioned a few times, this game is a roguelite, so death is not necessarily the end, which is where the lore we collect for completing objectives and the lore store come in. In between adventures, we can access the lore store and spend our lore there, which effectively equates to unlocks that we can then take on future runs, which includes a little bit of everything. Though, do keep in mind, in order to unlock things, you do have to complete certain things in campaigns to make them available. Some stuff is available right out of the gate, of course, but other things you have to complete certain prerequisites to even unlock them. And through the lore store, you can access all sorts of things, such as new classes, more items to set up your loadout, traits to give individual characters, which will just give them passive abilities at what they're good at, items, locations, cosmetics, mercenaries. Some of these items can even be upgraded to allow you to take more than one. There's also cosmetic options that simply make your characters look a little cooler. Locations will unlock new encounters on the overworld, for instance. So as you play the game, go on more and more adventures, you can unlock more and more rewards and make the game easier for yourself, which is where the big roguelite portion of the game comes in. And when you put all of those things together, I think For the King 2 can offer a fun party-based roguelite RPG either for yourself or, again, up to 4-player co-op that, like the tabletop adventures it is inspired by, can provide either a pretty serious RPG or a zany adventure full of chance encounters. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, don't forget to check the link in the description below. But that is pretty much going to do it for this video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this look at For the King 2. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.